Well, hello, I'm Chris McElmurray, and I'll be your instructor for CST1530, Intro to Christian Theology. And just looking at the syllabus, you'll find my contact info in there. You can feel free to give me a call if it's an emergency and you need to get in touch with me. Also, just give me an email if you need to communicate about anything. I check it a few times a day, and I try to get back to you within 24 hours. Make sure you have a good translation of the Bible. That is a modern translation, not necessarily a paraphrased version. My favorite is the Holman Christian Standard. And also, go online and check out the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. And you'll find that link in the syllabus. Because we are talking about such a powerful, explosive subject, we're talking about religion, we're talking about doctrine. And they say there's two things you're not supposed to talk about in polite company. That's religion and politics. Well, we're talking about religion, And so we're talking about, God and how people view God and how God relates to people. So there's a high potential for offense in this class when people start dialoguing, especially in the discussion forums. And the reason why is because tone of voice doesn't always come through in text when you're typing text out there. And so please use the golden rule, respect, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, especially in discussion forums. Make sure that you're giving people the benefit of the doubt. Be tender-hearted toward others, and be tough-skinned. So this is our own individual faith, which is transferring from a monologue into a context where we're going to be conversing with others, communicating with other people, and that's faith in dialogue. That's a conversation. So there's some give and take, some back and forth. Be ready for that. But please, we don't want any conflict, and so let's try to avoid that. Late work, just letting you know, not crazy about late work. I don't like it, so if it's accepted, there will usually be a penalty unless there's a really. What I would like to do now is I would just like to go through some of the finer points and draw out some things that I would like to talk about, things that are in the text, maybe things that aren't in the text, and just start off with this concept of a rationale that lies back of our subject. Why study theology? What's the basis for theology? Why are we doing this? Why are we taking this class? First and foremost, just because knowledge is a virtue. It's better to know something. It's almost always better to know something than to not know something. Oftentimes our source of knowledge will determine whether our knowledge is genuine knowledge or whether it's misinformation. And so a lot of times we do this open source theology where we just get our theology from the culture, from pop culture, and from our neighbors, and there's this general this feeling of ideas that we absorb from our society and from our own thinking, and TV and books and magazines about who and what God is and what religion is all about and what Christianity teaches. Well, what we're doing in this class is we're actually sitting down and we're thinking. We're really thinking about this stuff. This is an opportunity for clarification. Instead of having disorganized, muddy thinking, this is an opportunity for us to sharpen up and tighten up our thinking, to clarify some things. The question is, what do we know? What do we know? Humility is required. When we're talking about knowledge, we could get into the classical definition of knowledge as justified true belief. But at the end of the day, we have to realize that we're only the sometime knowing knowers of some things. we don't know everything. You know, that's one of the things about this. We're not God. God is the all the time knowing knower of all things. We're the sometime knowing knowers of some things. And so we're going to have to exercise a little bit of humility when it comes to what we think we know. One of the things about that is this, is whether you self-identify as a Christian or not, Christianity might not be what you think it is. As you study doctrine in this course, you might find out that Christianity is not what you thought it was. You might be a Christian and find out that Christianity is not what you thought it was. You might be a non-Christian and be surprised to find out that Christianity is not what you thought it was. So if we talk about what theology is, you know, here's the word itself. Theology. It comes from the Greek word theos and logos, if you break it down. God, theos means God, and logos means word, reason, or discourse. Discourse is a fancy word for, you know, study or thinking about, you know, dialogue or lecturing. So here's the thing, you know, theology is thinking about God, as Fisher Humphreys has defined for us. But it's not really just God himself, but God in relation to the world that we find ourselves in. God in relation to the people that we find ourselves relating to. So it's God and how God relates. So there's different kinds of theology. We start with biblical theology, the ideas about God that are revealed as we go through this library of documents called the Bible. And you know, it's very important to interpret you know, that theology, you know, on its own terms as we find it in those documents there. And then there's the theology that's developed throughout the history of the church, and that's historical theology. And so that, you know, shows you how people thought about things in the early church, and then how things progressed, and how they thought about God, and how he related to the world in the medieval period and during Roman Catholicism, and then later on during the Protestant Reformation, and later on in the modern period. And so you know, that's historical theology. Philosophical theology basically takes the concepts about God and looks at them from a philosophical perspective. You know, is it possible for God to have these attributes? How does God relate to evil? You know, what are some evidences of the existence of God? You know, how does God relate to ethics? And then there's practical theology. There's what it does for you. How do you live it out in everyday life? How do you apply it in community, in church, in ministry? And so these are the various items of theology, but when you add a lot of their components up, you get what we call systematic theology. Now, sometimes systematic theology is kind of trimmed back and abbreviated. It's just what the Bible says on any given topic, and so we're sorting things into nice, neat little bins. God, revelation, Christ, the Spirit, the church, and stuff like that. But the thing about theology is they don't always come in these neat little ideas that are hermetically sealed off from these other ideas so they can be thrown into these separate bins. The thing is, they're not always separate. They come stuck together to other ideas, and so they're a lot of times a complex. They're a cartel of ideas, a gang that come together. And so the thing about systematic theology, if we're using a very abbreviated version, is just that anything, you know, what the Bible says about salvation, this one particular topic, what the Bible says about the end times, or the last things, the final states. Whereas a broader, more full definition of systematic theology integrates all of these. Well, a couple of theologians have done a really good job of giving the fullest definition. It's Gordon Lewis and Bruce Demarest, and they call it integrative theology. So that's a full-bodied systematic theology there. But the primary starting point, and I've underlined this to make sure that you see this, is that theology has to begin with the Bible. You know, there's the Wesleyans, the Methodists, they have a quadrilateral. You have the Bible, reason, experience, and tradition, like church tradition. That these are sources that we draw from, and yes, we experience God, and yes, we reason and think about God, and yes, we receive things from the church about God. But the big emphasis in most systems of theology, it begins with the Bible. And so that's where we ought to begin, is biblical theology there. Now, you notice practical theology, how it works and how it works itself out in the life of people and a community. There's a phrase in James 2:14a. It begins in the Greek of the New Testament, ti ta ophilos. What does it get you? What do you gain? What does it benefit you? What do you profit? So what good is it? What good is it? And if we have a good theology, a correct theology, something that starts to get oriented toward the truth, then that theology ought to be good for something. My father used to say this statement. It used to bug me to no end. He used to say, "Son, make sure that you don't end up being so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good." And I thought that was ridiculous. You know, who's so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good? But the longer I, go in my experience and I deal with church, sometimes I see what he's talking about. That we have a tendency to focus, to escape into the abstract and the ideal, and we're not really in the world. God working through us in the world. We need to be of some kind of use. We need to be, of some good. And so that's something that we need to make sure that we answer there. My father's complaint, and so good theology ought to be good through and through, affecting how we think, feel, want, speak, and act. Okay? All right.